corporations, local governance even?
Well, change isn't going to come from within a structure. You know, if you are inducted into a corporation, you have to be broken to survive. You are hazed in the same way that you are if you join a fraternity or sorority. I mean, you know, if you're hired by Goldman Sachs, first of all, you know, you're vetted because they want to make sure you're compliant. And then when they get you in there, they put you through such punishing and grueling apprenticeship program. I mean, for instance, when you're first hired by Goldman Sachs, they do things like call a meeting for all the new employees at 6 o'clock in a conference room, and nobody actually shows up until 10. And anybody who gets up and leaves before 10 o'clock is fired. So they winnow it down, and by the end, you're, you know, by the time you get to the upper echelons of these corporations, you have some deeply deformed and demented individuals who, you know, often exhibit the classic characteristics of psychopaths. You know, an incapacity for remorse or guilt, a penchant for self-aggrandizement and manipulation, all the things we celebrate, by the way, in reality television shows. You know, there's a great theologian, Paul Tillich, who said that all institutions, including the church, are inherently demonic, and that for those who care to live the moral life, even, and I've worked in institutions, I mean, I worked in the New York Times, I came out of the church, but I don't think it's accidental that I got pushed out of each, because there always comes a moment when, you know, what you know is right means that you are going to destroy your own career. And in my case, it came after being the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. 7 years in the Middle East, a lot of that time in Iraq, 2002, the whole build-up to the war in Iraq. Now, there are very few Arabists in this country, and by that I mean people who've lived for significant time in the Arab world, who speak Arabic, and I had just written War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, so I was on shows like Charlie Rose and everything else, and I would be asked, well, what about Iraq? What should we do? Now, I had been a long time at the paper, 15 years at the paper. I understood that to denounce that war was to essentially, you know, obliterate my career, and most reporters would dodge it. But for me, I fortunately had my father. And my father was a Presbyterian minister who was very involved in the civil rights movement, and we lived in an all-white farm town in upstate New York, where in the early 1960s, Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America. He had been a sergeant in North Africa in World War II. He was very active in the anti-war movement, and I would be hauled off at 10, 11 with my sister, and I did an event actually with Pete Seeger a few months ago, actually came out and played the banjo before I talked. And I told Seeger that I'd seen him in like 1967 singing on the steps of the Albany Capitol, and the greatest sacrifice that I had made to the peace movement is that when we all sang "We Shall Overcome," I'd actually held my sister's hand. But what destroyed my father's career was gay rights. My uncle, my father's youngest brother, was gay and lived with his partner in Greenwich Village and had been disowned by his family. And the only family that Jamie and his partner had was our family. And my father's great strength was that he was deeply in touch with the suffering. He knew what it meant to be a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s, and he translated that to all gay men. And he was calling for the ordination and marriage for gender equality. This is the 1970s, and the church was not forgiving of that. I went to Colgate, and he had a church in Syracuse, and when he found out that there was no gay and lesbian organization, he brought the gay speakers to my campus. And I would sit around with small groups of students and gay activists and my dad, and this led eventually to my father trying to push the students to come out of the closet, come out publicly, and they said, we're just too scared, we don't want to do it. That was a problem that my dad solved by driving down one day, taking me out to lunch, and telling me that I had to found the gay lesbian organization at Colgate, which I did. I didn't go. I had my name on it every Tuesday. And when I'd walk into the dining hall for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, my dad would the checker would check it off, check off the box and hand it back to me and go, faggot. So as the pressure came down on my dad, I'm talking about institutions and changing from within, my father became only more militant. And he came down and got me one Easter, and he said, you know, this is probably the last time you'll hear me preach, because he organized an Easter service for the GBTL community in Syracuse, publicly. And he got up in the pulpit and he said, marriage is a sacrament. Marriage is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that does not honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian. And that was the end of it. But I'll tell you, when I was sitting in the New York Times, after being given a formal written reprimand for denouncing the war in Iraq, and that's the process. They give you the written reprimand, and then when you violate it, you're fired. I knew that I faced a choice. And that choice was I could muzzle myself and pay fealty to my career, or I could betray my father. And I couldn't do that, and that's when I quit. Thank you.